to fight you, Flash.
I wouldn't want to fight me neither.
Spider-Man was one of the first movies I ever watched. I don't remember much else from around then. Mostly I remember the color, more than I remember what was happening. Red and blue, everything moving. This kid in a mask who seemed just as unsure of himself as I was. That was the whole thing for a while. Then it turned into a habit I couldn't shake. Collected the toys till I ran out of room for them. Read every comic I could get my hands on. Tracked down every version of Peter Parker there was, in every medium, because one version stopped being enough pretty fast. Somewhere in there, the character stopped being a movie I liked and turned into something closer to a set of instructions. Get back up. Do the right thing even when nobody's watching. Keep going. I didn't know I was picking up a way of thinking. I thought I was just a kid who liked spiders. Watching it again as an adult, after 20 years of sitting through comic book movies, I noticed something the kid version of me felt without being able to say it. This wasn't even the first superhero movie. Hollywood had already tried Superman, tried Batman, tried Blade, tried the X-Men. Some of it worked. None of it reshaped the business the way this one eventually would. So what did a movie about some kid who can't catch a school bus do that 4 other franchises full of capes and cowls couldn't? The answer starts before the bite. Before the wrestling match, before Uncle Ben, before any of it, it starts with the bus. Hey, I'm Mac. Welcome to Mac and Flicks. By 2001, the superhero movie had already gone through 2 good runs and 2 bad crashes, and everybody in the business basically had the math memorized. Richard Donner's Superman showed the whole town in 1978 that a comic book character could carry a real budget and real craft. Christopher Reeve was flying on wires that cost more than some entire movies, and audiences bought every second of it. Superman 2 kept that going. Then the studio started cutting corners you could actually feel on screen. Superman 3 turned into a buddy comedy with Richard Pryor in it. Superman 4 got made on a fraction of the old budget and looked exactly like it. A character that had once seemed impossible to mess up turned into a punchline in under 10 years. Same thing happened again with Batman, just faster. Tim Burton's 1989 movie turned into a merchandising machine on the same scale as Superman's best years. Within about 10 years, the tone had swung from gothic all the way to neon, and by 1997, you get Batman and Robin, a movie basically designed around a toy line as much as an actual story. Nipples molded onto the batsuit. Arnold Schwarzenegger cracking ice puns between fight scenes. It flopped badly enough that it became the industry's go-to example of what happens when you hand a character over to the toy department instead of an actual storyteller. So twice in 20 years, 2 different studios watched the exact same thing happen to 2 totally different characters. A comic book movie could work huge, and then fall apart just as fast, taking the whole genre's credibility down with it on the way out. Nobody learns that lesson from a memo. You learn it by watching your own stock price and your own trade headlines for a few humiliating months straight. And once you've learned it, it sticks. By the late 90s, greenlighting a superhero movie basically meant betting against your own studio's biggest public failure happening all over again on your watch. Every fix the industry reached for was still about the costume. Bigger budgets, cleaner effects, a straighter face on the whole genre. Nobody touched the character underneath it. Marvel had its own version of that problem, and a lot less room to fix it. Comic books in the early 90s had gotten treated like investments. Foil covers, polybagged variants, sold to collectors who figured scarcity meant value. It didn't. The market crashed once people realized none of it was rare. After the bubble burst, on top of years of financial trouble already piling up, Marvel filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1996, basically a legal process that lets a company keep operating while it figures out how to pay back everyone it owes money to. A company that owns some of the most recognizable characters in American pop culture was stuck selling off movie rights piece by piece just to keep the lights on. And nobody was exactly lining up to overpay for characters nobody knew how to sell to a regular audience. Spider-Man's rights alone had been stuck in legal disputes between a bunch of different studios for most of the decade. So the one character everyone agreed was Marvel's biggest asset was also the one nobody could actually turn into a movie. 2 smaller movies kept the lights on while all this was happening. Blade turned a profit in 1998 that caught everybody off guard. This R-rated vampire hunter movie, built from a character most people had never even heard of, helped along by a DVD market that was just starting to reward exactly this kind of mid-budget genre movie. X-Men came along 2 years later and pulled in $54.4 million on its opening weekend by treating mutant persecution like a real allegory instead of a costume party. Both movies reopened a door the industry had slammed shut. Spider-Man was about to kick it clean off its hinges. Blade stayed filed under horror. X-Men stayed filed under science fiction with capes. What neither one did was put one ordinary kid right at the center of the frame and make the audience sit with him before he ever got any powers. Blade proved the costume could work dressed up as horror. X-Men proved it could work dressed up as science fiction. Neither one ever tried taking it off. None of that explains why anybody thought a movie that couldn't even keep its own rights straight for 25 years was going to be the one that finally broke the pattern. The first real attempt to get Spider-Man on screen came from Cannon Films, a company that made its name on cheap action sequels and had zero feel for the character. Back in the mid-1980s, they bought the rights off Marvel for $225,000, which tells you pretty much everything about how little anyone thought this character was worth at the time. Canon's guys running the show, Menahem Golan and Yoram Globus, decided Spider-Man was basically a horror concept, something in the neighborhood of the Wolfman with a costume on. So they hired Tobey Hooper, the guy who made the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and commissioned a script where Peter Parker was a lab photographer instead of a student. A corporate scientist named Dr. Zork deliberately irradiates him on purpose. He mutates into a suicidal, 8-armed, half-human creature, and his whole plan is leading an army of animal hybrids to take over the world. Stan Lee had to step in personally and drag the whole thing back towards something that resembled the comic. Hooper walked away, and a second writing team gave it another shot with Dr. Octopus as the villain, kicking around names like Bob Hoskins for the tentacles and Christopher Lee in a supporting role, with rumors of a young Tom Cruise playing Peter Parker. At one point, Canon had a real budget in mind, $15 to $20 million. Then the studio's money ran out after a string of other flops. The budget got slashed to under $10 million, and the whole thing collapsed into that pile of Hollywood movies that almost happened. While Canon's version was falling apart, a very different kind of filmmaker was quietly putting together the version that would actually survive. James Cameron, fresh off Terminator 2, spent years developing his own take for Carolco Pictures, and wrote a 47-page scriptment, this hybrid between a screenplay and a treatment that took Peter Parker seriously as a character for the first time anyone had. Cameron's biggest, longest-lasting contribution was a call about biology. In the comics, Peter builds his own web shooters, a mechanical gadget invented by a teenage genius. Cameron thought that was pretty unbelievable for a broke kid from Queens, so he rewrote the bite as a full-body mutation, webbing included, and turned the whole transformation into a stand-in for puberty, waking up with a body you didn't ask for and can't fully control. When Carolco went bankrupt too, that scriptment survived the wreckage anyway, and it became the blueprint everyone after him kept borrowing from, whether they admitted it or not. The rights themselves took one more ridiculous detour before they landed anywhere useful. Sony's Columbia Pictures had a tangled claim on James Bond, too, left over from an old legal fight involving a producer named Kevin McClory. MGM owned Bond outright otherwise, and they wanted that competing claim gone for good. So in 1999, the two studios cut a deal. Sony agreed to give up any claim on Bond, including the rights to Casino Royale, and paid MGM roughly $10 million on top of that to close it out. In exchange, MGM handed over Spider-Man. Sony walked away with a character that would eventually make them billions, out of a deal that was really about a completely different franchise. Every failed version up to this point shared the same blind spot, and nobody involved ever named it out loud. Canon wanted a monster. Cameron got closer, caring about Peter as a character in a way nobody before him had, but even his version still treated the spider as the main attraction. Whoever held the rights next kept inheriting a version of that same instinct. 25 years of false starts, and too many of them still put the costume before the kid. Once the rights settled, Sony brought in David Koepp, the screenwriter behind Jurassic Park and Mission Impossible, to turn 2 decades of false starts into something you could actually shoot. Koepp's early drafts, including stuff inherited from Cameron's era, still piled on villains. Electro, Sandman, Dr. Octopus, sometimes all 3 at once. It was Raimi, once he signed on to direct, who pushed to cut it down to 1. He wanted the whole film built around Norman Osborn instead, arguing the story needed room to be about one relationship, instead of splitting attention 3 ways, and Koepp executed the rewrite. Cameron's organic web shooters survived the cut too, backed by Raimi and by Sony's own executives, who liked the idea that if the bite gives you a spider's strength and a spider's instincts, it should give you a spider's silk as well. No mechanical gadget required. Koepp kept sole writing credit after a formal review the Writers Guild runs to settle exactly this kind of dispute, but the shooting script that got filmed passed through 2 more hands first. Scott Rosenberg came in under Raimi to sharpen the pacing of the action, making sure every set piece pushed the plot forward instead of just interrupting it. Alvin Sargent, an Oscar winner known for intimate character work like Ordinary People, polished the dialogue and deepened the whole Peter and Mary Jane tension. People rarely remember any of those 3 names. The finished script reading like a coming-of-age story that happens to have a wrestling match and a glider fight in it, instead of the other way around, is basically their doing. Raimi himself was an odd fit on paper, and a perfect one in practice. He'd built his career on The Evil Dead and Darkman, low-budget horror with a gleeful, physical style, movies where bodies get twisted and broken, and the camera never politely looks away. He'd also been reading Spider-Man since he was a kid, so the studio wasn't hiring him for his box office track record. Neither Evil Dead nor Darkman had one worth chasing. They were hiring him because he understood, on a gut level, what it feels like when a body stops belonging to the person living in it. That background sounds completely wrong for a mainstream superhero movie, until you actually watch what he does with the transformation scene, which plays less like a gift and more like a fever. Raimi wanted the swinging to feel like a ballet, his word, not a stunt reel, and that instinct shaped everything that came after in the effects work. The casting followed the same instinct toward the unglamorous. this. Tobey Maguire had built his career on quiet, subdued movies like The Ice Storm, not action leads. Willem Dafoe took the Green Goblin and played it like a real tragedy instead of a punchline. J.K. Simmons showed up as J. Jonah Jameson and somehow became the definitive version of the character in what amounts to a handful of scenes. Danny Elfman wrote a score that leaned earnest instead of ironic, at a moment when ironic was the safer, easier choice. Every one of those calls ran against the obvious, bankable version of this story, and that's basically why it took 25 years to get made in the first place. Nobody before this thought a character this human was worth the risk. After almost 2 decades of monster movies, scriptments, right swaps, and a small army of writers who never got credit for any of it, Spider-Man finally started filming in early 2001. What made it to the screen kept the one thing every failed version before it had dropped without even noticing. Peter Parker had to be a person before he was ever allowed to be a superhero. Every version of the story that came before 2002 still put the spider before the kid, at least a little. Cap and Raimi flipped that completely. They opened the movie on Peter Parker chasing a school bus that's already pulling away, distracted by the girl riding inside it, and by the time he notices, he's missed it entirely. It's Mary Jane who actually gets the driver to stop for him, yelling out over the other kids laughing. He climbs on, thanks her, and gets tripped by another student before he even finds a seat. That's the whole opening move, and it does something none of the earlier drafts ever bothered doing. It tells you exactly how much power Peter has before the story hands him any. Peter can't even catch the school bus on his own. He can't talk to the girl next door. He gets bullied by kids who won't matter to the plot at all, because the point was never the bullies. It's the baseline. Every hero who came before him on screen started from strength. That man's got a fortune and a private army of gadgets. Superman's an alien god who chose to live among us. Spider-Man starts from a kid who can't make the bus. I recognized this without being able to explain it back when I was still collecting the toys and reading the comics. What hooked me first was watching a kid get laughed at on a bus and knowing exactly how that felt, before he ever climbed a wall. That recognition is built into the first 3 minutes of the film, before Peter has any powers to speak of, and no amount of marketing could have manufactured that. The film doubles down on it before the bite even happens. On the school trip to the Columbia University Genetics Lab, a tour guide walks the class through what these spiders can do. One that can jump to catch its prey, another whose web has the tensile strength of high-tension wire, a third with reflexes so fast, some researchers think it borders on precognition. And the whole time that's being explained out loud, Peter's getting shoved, ignored, and talked over by the popular kids standing 2 feet away from him. The gap between what he's about to become and what he currently is gets measured right there in that classroom, before a single spider bites anyone. Call it the bus rule. Before you let the audience care what a character can do, you've got to show them what he can't. Every studio that copied this movie in the years after copied The Mask first. The ones that actually worked copied the bus. That setup traces back to one clear source: Ultimate Spider-Man, Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Bagley's 2000s reboot of the character, and it happens to be my favorite Spider-Man comic ever printed. Many of the biggest changes this movie makes to the 1962 original come from there. Stan Lee's Peter meets a radioactive spider at a public science exhibit and doesn't meet Mary Jane or Harry until college. Bendis moved all of it into high school and swapped the radioactive spider for a genetically engineered one. The same genetic engineering idea this movie borrows, even if the movie moves the bite to a genetics lab at Columbia University instead of the corporate laboratory used in the comic. Even Norman Osborn's whole setup, a brilliant scientist testing an unstable formula on himself instead of a businessman who just stumbles into villainy, comes from Bendis' version more than Stan Lee's. The film splices 2 different eras of the same character together and mostly gets away with hiding the seams. The organic webbing follows Cameron's idea almost exactly. Less like a gift, more like a fever. Nobody teaches Peter how to use any of it. He discovers the stickiness by accident first, a fork stuck to his hand in the school cafeteria, webbing shooting out in his bedroom before he even understands what's happening to him. By the time he's up on a rooftop trying it on purpose, he's still missing his mark and yelling nonsense catchphrases at nobody, but at least now he's choosing to fail instead of stumbling into it. The powers show up as a problem before they ever show up as a solution, and what makes the whole origin work is that every step after that changes what Peter actually wants, not just what he can do. Take the wrestling match. It's a real promotion with a paying crowd and a wrestler named Bonesaw McGraw waiting in the ring, not the underground Fight Club version people sometimes remember it as. The first thing Peter does with real power is chase a payday, not a cause. He enters under a fake name so he can afford a car to impress a girl. He wins easily, and the promoter shortchanges him on the purse. When Peter calls him on it, the promoter brushes him off. I missed the part where that's my problem. Minutes later, a robber runs past with the promoter's own cash box, and Peter, still stinging from that exact line, lets him go and hands it right back. I missed the part where that's my problem. It's petty, not cool, And that's exactly the point. The movie handing Peter the villain's own logic and watching him use it. He had the power to stop what happened next and chose it anyway. That's the exact wrong lesson, learned from exactly the right kind of power, and it cost him his uncle within minutes. Kep's stage directions for the scene right before that death read almost like short fiction instead of technical instructions. The kind of writing that tells an actor what's happening underneath a line, not just what to say. The gist of it? There are things you say that you'd take back the second they leave your mouth, and this is one of them, and it's already too late. Most scripts just tell actors where to stand. This one tells them what kind of regret to actually carry into the take. That car ride does more work than almost anything else in the whole script, mostly through what gets said rather than what happens. Peter, humiliated and overwhelmed by everything happening to his body, snaps at Ben to stop pretending to be his father, and that ends up being the last real conversation they ever get. If that scene hit harder than a comic book movie should, you weren't imagining it. That's regret doing the work, not spectacle. The kind everybody carries from some fight with someone they loved, just dressed up in a costume you don't usually associate with it. I didn't get the lesson underneath that car ride when I first watched it as a kid. Power without responsibility gets people killed, and the guilt doesn't just go away because you put on a costume afterward. Norman Osborn gets handed the exact same setup and ends up in exactly the opposite place. He gets power too, this unstable serum he injects into himself, with the board threatening to pull him from his own project after a failed demonstration. And instead of corrupting him out of nowhere, it just strips away whatever was already holding him back. The film even stages it literally, Norman arguing with his own reflection in the mirror, the Goblin persona goading him into believing the normal rules don't apply to somebody with his ability. It's one of the most replayed scenes in superhero cinema for a reason. Raimi shoots it without any CGI tricks, splitting Dafoe into two performances. It's just Dafoe, alone, switching between Norman's panic and the Goblin's sneer, through nothing but his voice and his face, fast enough that you believe two different people are actually in the room. Where Peter gets handed strength and picks restraint, at a real cost that nearly breaks him, Norman gets handed strength and just stops restraining himself at all. Same kind of accident, opposite response. The father figure stuff makes the mirror even sharper. Norman's disappointed in his own son, Harry, writes him off as academically weak and unmotivated, and finds an easy substitute in Peter, whose scientific mind he respects. Standing outside Columbia University, he tells him, "I'm something of a scientist myself," recognizing something in a kid he barely knows. Peter ends up stuck between two father figures pulling him in opposite directions. Ben, who preaches restraint and responsibility, and dies for it, and Norman, who offers ambition and superiority and nearly costs Peter everyone he loves. By the time the Goblin figures out who Peter is, he's attacking the one kid he ever saw something of himself in, and that's exactly why the final fight reads as personal instead of just procedural. All of that is still just words on a page though, until somebody points a camera at it. Raimi's horror background shows up in places you wouldn't expect from a studio blockbuster, and it's most obvious in the scene where Peter's body starts changing. It plays like a hallucination, flashing images, a fever dream blur of skulls and shifting DNA, cut with the same nervous energy Raimi brought to the possession scenes in Evil Dead. A studio committee would have handed you a clean transformation. Raimi gives you one that looks like it hurts. The swinging sequences work off the opposite instinct, restraint dressed up as spectacle. Visual effects supervisor John Dykstra's team studied how a real body would move on a swing like that, how it would speed up, how it would pull at the bottom of each arc. That's why, when he hits the top of a swing, you can feel the strain, the same way you'd feel it watching a real stunt. To get the camera moving through New York in ways no helicopter shot ever could, the effects crew photographed real locations, like Times Square and the Queensboro Bridge, from hundreds of reference angles. Then they stitched it all into what visual effects supervisor Scott Stockdike called a virtual geodesic dome. Basically a fully rendered city Spider-Man could swing through that still looked like the real place. Even the shortcuts were built out of real photography first. Raimi called the whole goal a ballet in the sky, and that's the through line of the entire film in miniature. Even the most impossible looking moments are built out of something grounded underneath them. Raimi's comic instincts run on the exact same discipline the horror instincts do. The rooftop scene, where Peter tries to get his new abilities under control on purpose, plays almost entirely as physical comedy. He misfires, misses his mark, shouts nonsense catchphrases at nobody, none of it landing the way he wants. It's the bus rule again, just wearing a different costume. The film had already earned the right to make Peter look ridiculous with power, because it spent 3 minutes at the start making sure you knew exactly how little power he'd had before any of this. None of that spectacle would matter though, without something underneath it worth protecting. So if you've made it this far, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps a channel this size keep going. Anyway, Mary Jane Watson is basically a second version of Peter's exact problem, not some reward waiting at the end of the plot. She's somebody trying to escape a life that doesn't fit her, by attaching herself to whoever looks like an exit. The romance runs on dramatic irony the whole way through. Both of them care about the other, and neither one says so. partly out of nerves and partly because Peter's hiding an entire identity from her. When he finally does tell her how he feels, he doesn't by describing what he supposedly said to Spider-Man about her, borrowing a mask just to say something true, which is its own small piece of heartbreak. Danny Elfman's score earns its place in that same equation. It plays the romance and the heroics with the exact same sincerity. No ironic distance, no wink to the audience saying this is all a little silly. That choice matters more than it sounds like it should, because a knowing score would have undercut basically every emotional beat the screenplay built. The film's relationship with its own city landed harder than anyone involved could have planned for. An early teaser had Spider-Man catching a helicopter full of bank robbers in a web strung between the Twin Towers, and once the towers came down that September, Sony pulled the trailer and recalled every poster showing them reflected in the lenses of Spider-Man's mask. The finished film didn't shrink away from New York either. During the climax on the Queensboro Bridge, regular bystanders throw trash and bottles at the Goblin themselves, one of them yelling that messing with Spider-Man means messing with the whole city. A movie that had been in production before the attacks came out about 8 months after them, and audiences who were still raw from that fall watched a story about their own city getting protected by somebody who was, underneath the mask, just as unprepared for any of it as they were. The ending is where all of it converges, and it lands as loss dressed up as protection, not as some noble triumph. Mary Jane tells Peter she loves him right after Norman's funeral, the exact moment he's wanted since before he ever had powers, and he lies to her face instead, saying they can only be friends. He's just watched what happens to the people he cares about the second the Goblin finds out who they are to him. Plenty of later MCU films with a hero giving something up would try the same beat, and most of them never earn it the way this one does, because this one built the cost across 2 full hours before it ever asked Peter to pay it. A screenplay breakdown can't show you any of that. A box office report can, 3 days later, in numbers nobody in the building had priced in. Nobody in the business thought a single weekend could hold more than $90 million. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone had set that number the year before, and people genuinely treated it like a hard ceiling, limited by how many theaters existed and how many hours a weekend actually has. Spider-Man opened across 3,615 of them. By Sunday night, the total was $114.8 million. Not close to the ceiling. Through it, with room to spare, an average of $31,769 in every single theater showing it. The highest per theater average any wide release had ever posted, and the first movie in history to cross the 100 million mark before a single Monday trade report even went out. The record held for more than 4 years, until Pirates of the Caribbean: Dead Man's Chest finally beat it in 2006, and the movie that beat that record the following summer was Spider-Man's own sequel. The ceiling stayed broken. Nobody was out there rebuilding it, they were just racing each other to see who could clear it by more. Domestically, Spider-Man finished the year at $403.7 million, ahead of The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers at $339.8 million, and Star Wars Episode II at $310.7 million, beating 2 of the most anticipated franchise sequels of the whole decade, with a character most studios had spent 20 years treating like a punchline. Worldwide, it crossed $826.8 million on a $139 million budget, the highest grossing comic book movie ever made at that point, by a wide margin. Sony wasn't the only one doing math that weekend either. Marvel didn't own the theater chains. It didn't own the marketing budget. What Marvel owned was the character himself. And up until that Sunday night, Marvel had basically been renting him out to Sony for a flat fee, nowhere close to what he'd just proven he was worth. Inside Marvel's own offices, one number mattered most. In 2002, the money Marvel made just from licensing, putting Spider-Man's face on toys, shirts, lunchboxes, whatever, jumped 99%, up to $79.6 million. Some of that jump was Marvel having just reclaimed its own licensing business from a company called Toy Biz after the bankruptcy, but the movie is what made reclaiming it worth fighting for. That's Marvel's own cut from merchandise alone, not the movie's box office, and it nearly doubled in a single year. A company that had been in bankruptcy only 6 years earlier suddenly had hard proof sitting right in front of it. These characters, all of them, were worth a lot more than anyone had been paying Marvel for them. David Mizell saw that number and had a problem with it. Mizell was a former talent agent who'd become president of Marvel Studios, and his math was simple. Sony had just made $826 million off Spider-Man. Marvel, the company that actually owned the character, had collected a licensing fee. A small slice, nothing close to that. His pitch to the rest of the company was blunt. Stop renting these characters out to other studios. Start making the movies yourselves. Keep the money. There was just one problem. Making movies cost real money, and Marvel didn't have it. So in 2005, Marvel went to Merrill Lynch, a major Wall Street bank, and took out a loan. A big one. $525 million over 7 years. That loan came with a catch though. To get it, Marvel had to put something up as a guarantee, the same way you'd put your car up as collateral for a car loan, except what Marvel put up was 10 of its own characters. Captain America, Black Panther, the entire Avengers roster. If the movies flopped and Marvel couldn't pay the loan back, the bank would simply take those characters for good. It was a real gamble, but it only made sense because Spider-Man, and X-Men before it, had already proven something. Comic book movies could pull real money out of a mainstream audience, not just the people who'd actually read the comics. Marvel took the gamble anyway and put out Iron Man in 2008, and it followed a similar character-first structure to what Kep had worked out 6 years earlier. A flawed lead, humor built into the character instead of stacked on top of him, real personal stakes running underneath the spectacle instead of getting replaced by it. Iron Man worked. Marvel kept building from there, one connected movie at a time, until the Marvel Cinematic Universe became the model every studio in Hollywood tried to copy. The industry still runs on decisions that one weekend forced. Big tentpoles used to launch around Memorial Day or the 4th of July. Sony put this one out on the first weekend of May instead, a slot The Mummy Returns had already tested a year earlier, without anyone else following its lead. And the results this time were loud enough that the date itself turned into real estate. For the next 2 decades, that same slot got claimed almost exclusively by superhero movies. Iron Man, The Avengers, Guardians of the Galaxy, one after another. And Tobey Maguire wasn't even a box office draw walking in, just an actor known for quiet dramas. The film had to sell the character instead of the actor, because it didn't have a star to sell in the first place. Every studio watching took the same lesson from it. Brands could sell a movie just as well as a star could. Even the comic books eventually caught up. Marvel's own pages gave Peter organic web shooters in 2004, years after the movie did it first, quietly retiring the mechanical gadgets he'd had on the page since 1962, at least for a while, before a later storyline walked it back. Sony collected a licensing fee on a character it helped build into one of the most valuable franchises on the planet, financed on a $525 million bet nobody outside the building thought was safe. 20 years earlier, Canon Films had bought that same character for $225,000 and tried to turn him into a monster. The distance between those two numbers is basically the whole argument. That opening image is still the first thing I picture when this movie comes up. Some kid, running, missing the bus, getting laughed at by everyone around him, saved only because the one person he cared about happened to notice him at all. 20 years and 100 imitators later, that's still the only opening any of them has actually earned. I didn't know, watching that as a kid, that I was picking up something I'd need for the rest of my life. Get back up. Do the right thing, even when nobody's watching. Keep going. Especially when it costs you something. I understood that as a rule for a comic book character way before I understood it as a rule for myself, and it's come back around more times than I ever expected it to. Hollywood spent the next 20 years chasing bigger stakes because this movie worked. More villains, bigger set pieces, whole universes stacked on top of each other. People showed up anyway for a nerd who can't catch a bus, or a kid whose uncle dies because of one selfish choice, treated like a whole person instead of a punchline waiting for a costume. Every studio that's ever gotten this genre right, before Spider-Man and after it, remembered that part first. I'm still not over it. If this is the version of Spider-Man that got you too, I've got a whole playlist digging into the rest of the character. The sequels, the reboots, everywhere Sony's taken him since. Click through and watch the rest.